Okay, let's get some analysis now from James Dorsey. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Singapore. James, it's always wonderful to have your contribution here on TRT World. Russia is becoming increasingly isolated. Do you think that Russian President Vladimir Putin has been embarrassed on the world stage?
I think he's miscalculated. I think he's overreached. And I think there's no doubt that militarily he could win. The question is at what price? So, for example, the longer a siege or a siege of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, or an attempt to take the Ukrainian capital takes, the more difficult it becomes for those who are willing to give Russia some degree of slack. For example, China, for example, India, or the United Arab Emirates. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to support Russia. And in that sense, I think, Vladimir Putin has put Russia in a very difficult position, and it's going to be difficult to get out of it.
Some commentators say the level of Ukrainian resistance is making Russia look weak. Do you think that that could prompt Moscow to try and prove them wrong by exerting strength in other areas, in other regions such as Syria, perhaps?
I think there's no doubt that the Russians miscalculated in terms of what Ukrainian resistance would be to the invasion. I don't think it's an issue so much as being weak. There are models of what happens in these situations in the past. And the question is, what model is Putin willing to engage with, and what model are the Ukrainians able to sustain? So, with other words, if you go back to the Chechen War, which your reporter earlier referred to, the Russians were brutal. They literally devastated the capital of Grozny. Now, that's something which they could do in Grozny because they were fighting Islamists and jihadists, and so therefore the world was willing to look away. It was the far from my bed show. Ukraine's very different, and so that may not be an option. On the other hand, if you look at the model of Iraq, in Iraq you saw the Iraqi military being disbanded by the Americans, and it was Iraqi military that gave the backbone to the resistance against the Americans, which was very deadly. So I think that this is whichever way this unfolds, this is not a scenario that Putin had envisioned.
We were talking a little bit earlier in the program about SWIFT and Russia's exclusion from it. Do you think that that could push Russia closer to China in an effort to create an alternate system?
Russia has been talking about an alternative system for quite some time. The Chinese have hinted at it, but certainly not to the extent of which the Russians have talked about it. There's no question in my mind that Putin, at least for the short term, was prepared for these kind of sanctions. I think there's one thing to keep in mind. An earlier guest of yours said the central bank and its reserves. That's true. But as far as we know, only 16% of central bank reserves are in US dollars. The rest are in gold, they're in euros, and they are in Chinese renminbi. So the effect of the sanctions on the central bank is going to be somewhat limited and delayed. The problem for Russia is going to be that these sanctions are over time going to really start to bite. And in the meantime, they're going to be losing a war in terms of public opinion, making it more difficult for other countries to be supportive.
Talking about a war of public opinion, what do you make of this outbreak of anti-government protests in Russia, something that perhaps is not all too common in the country? Do you think that this is going to continue, or is Russia going to move very swiftly and stamp out that visible opposition to the war?
Well, it has moved very quickly. Large numbers of people, hundreds at least, have been arrested. Now, the protests have continued nevertheless, but if experience of the past is anything, ultimately they are going to be able to repress it. But what these demonstrations show us, I think they reflect more than opposition to the war. Opposition to the war is a spark, but there clearly is widespread discontent in Russia that was suppressed with the arrest and jailing of Navalny, the opposition leader, the curtailing of the media, as we're now just seeing in terms of ability to report on the Ukraine war. So this is an expression of a much broader problem that Vladimir Putin has.
And one we will be following, and we appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much for your latest out of Singapore, James Dorsey.
Pleasure.